If we flip the switch, is this going to cause some kind of blackout situation or some other, unpredictable catastrophe?
It's not that we necessarily have to create and generate more power. It's that we need to be smarter with the power that we have.
What is the actual scale of this virtual power plant as it exists kind of today? Can we do that from a sort of technical engineering point of view without causing the grid to collapse in some mysterious way?
A lot of different elements of this point to this is a good idea to help solve a problem that we are all scratching our heads about. Why cut the funding?
Building infrastructure, no matter what kind it is, it takes a long time, it's expensive. If there's things we can do that are easier, we need to be doing them. And I think what this experiment shows in California is that VPPs really are a promising way to do that.
Just a few weeks ago, California's biggest electric utilities ran a test that could ultimately come to redefine the grid as we know it. They picked a hot day, right around peak demand in the evening hours, and switched on residential batteries in north of 100,000 homes. The top power companies then drew power from those batteries into the state's grid. Want to guess what happened next? I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and today we are going to find out what happened together, because it seems like California might have just figured out how we're going to solve the demand problem without fossil fuels. I'm so excited to welcome our guest for today's episode. This is someone whose work I have been following for quite some time. It has been fundamental for me as I have gotten to know the utility and energy industries over the last year or so. He covers the space with really just thoughtfulness and honesty, and we're really lucky to have him here today to tell us what the hell's happening in California and what it means for the grid of the future. So welcome to Power Perspectives, Tim McDonnell, climate and energy editor at Semafor. Tim, how's it going?
Thank you, Kinsey, for such a kind introduction. I don't deserve it. Thank you. No, it's great to be here with you. Yeah, things
We
are good.
disagree already, Tim. I already disagree.
Good.
You do deserve it.
That's what makes podcasts juicy. People want disagreement, so
Of
give
course,
them what
yeah,
they want.
we're fighting already.
Yeah.
No,
Good.
but we are big fans of Semafor over here. Your team and the work that they do
Thank you.
is really important and
Thank
really,
you.
really wonderful. So I'm excited
Thank
to
you.
talk to you today about this VPP story that you worked on. It is super interesting. We have a lot to cover. But before we get into more of the details and the particulars, I do have a quick question to get us started, because we are going to be talking a lot today about VPPs. Virtual power plants kind of fall under that umbrella of terms that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for the purposes of this conversation and as it stands today, can you tell me what you consider to be a VPP to tee us up?
Sure. So, I mean, yeah, it's a fun term. I guess it does mean different things. It sort of depends on what you count as a tool here. But I mean, the basic concept is we have ways of kind of reaching into the grid, into people's, whether it's electric vehicle batteries, bigger batteries that people have in their homes, grid scale storage, or even, reaching into your home and doing something like turning down the thermostat or kind of controlling energy use in homes and businesses. These are sort of techniques that electric utilities are able to use nowadays that give them some level of control over resources in the grid that they didn't used to be able to control. And the result of this is that you get all these extra kind of electrons at your disposal without building a new power plant. So that's sort of why it's called, a virtual power plant, where we're able to kind of add more electricity to the grid just by making better use of the existing assets that are there, rather than doing something very expensive like building a new solar farm, wind farm, gas plant, nuclear power plant, whatever it is. We can kind of skip that step and find some more power in the existing system. So that's a virtual power plant.
Perfect. And skip that step that is very, very expensive. It's horrible.
Right.
It is resource intensive. And a lot of people on the show in the last couple of episodes, we had Jigger Shaw on a couple weeks ago talk about it's not a generation problem. We think about this generational demand issue that we're facing with hyperscalers and data centers and AI and electrification. It's not that we necessarily have to create and generate more power. It's that we need to be smarter with the power that we have. So this grid mod kind of conversation is certainly very, very timely for all the people who are listening to this episode. So we're going to dig into this specific story that I tried to really dramatically tee up this story out of California. But I would love if you could give us a little bit more context and finish the story that I tried to start telling. You covered this really well over at Semafor, and I'd love just the rundown of what happened in California. They turn on all these batteries, ... and then what?
Well, the I mean, actually, the funny end of the story is that it was sort of dot dot dot, and then nothing happened, which was kind of the but that was the test, right? So I mean, that what they found was very very interesting doing this test to see, okay, you know, if we wanted to go through as the utility and try to touch as many batteries in our kind of home and EV batteries in our network as we can, and just to get a better sense of what is the actual scale of this virtual power plant as it exists kind of today, what would we get? And also, can we do that from a sort of technical engineering point of view without causing the grid to collapse in some mysterious way? And this, this had been done in smaller scales, but what was really interesting in this California test, it was the biggest kind of test like this that's been done, definitely in California, I believe, in the U.S. up to this point. And so the big question was going into this, if we flip the switch, is this going to cause some kind of blackout situation or some other unpredictable catastrophe? And it didn't. So that's the kind of most important thing here in some ways, is that nothing happened. But what they found uh in kind of reaching out in this way was to get a sense of the scale of the power plant, and basically what they came up with at the end was about half a gigawatt, so something like 535 megawatts of capacity. It's kind of, similar to building like a small gas-fired power plant, something that's kind of in the half gigawatt kind of range, which was just there through the use of technology and software and existing batteries and existing grid networks without having to spend a huge amount of money on actually building something like a new gas plant and all of the various complications and costs that go into that. So it was just a very really interesting kind of experience over there in California.
And who are some of the key players here? The big utilities were involved, but who else? Who are the names to know? And who's the who, right, of this story?
Yeah, I mean, most of the batteries in this case were Tesla or Sunrun, kind of operated through these systems. Pacific Gas and Electric and was one of the main utilities involved here. But so there were a number of different kind of names involved. It was a sort of statewide effort, and because all of these different companies and technologies have to work together, and it was just really interesting to see how much of this stuff has already been built, and is a and I think what's important to note here is that it's also, and we can talk more about this, but solving this kind of problem of this so-called duck curve, which we can talk about more. That's a really important part of this story. This kind of crisis of too much solar that California has had in the last several years, and that's caused a number of problems for them. This virtual power plant is also a way of kind of dealing with that.
Yeah, and let's dig into that. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon that is certainly happening in California where there is sunshine aplenty. What does it mean for, California specifically as a giant state, really a bellwether of a lot of interesting technology and utility strategy and all that good stuff? What does the fact that this experiment happened in California and that there was sort of the success of nothing happening, right? What does that indicate regarding California's strategy moving forward to try and solve for that duck curve or to try to modify the grid or modernize the grid in a way that can meet the moment, but also meet the environment where it is very sunny and we do have all of these other different, extenuating circumstances?
Right. I mean, the whole challenge with renewables, right, is their sort of intermittent nature, and but and which some if some policymakers would sort of frame as like a reason not to use them or some kind of disaster in the making, but actually it's just a very predictable attribute that wind and solar have, that they work better at sometimes than others, and there's a million different ways that people are coming up with to manage that problem. What California has been experiencing recently is just that they have so much solar in the state now that at the moments of peak solar production in the middle of the day, on a sunny day, they're getting too much solar. And then, when people come home from work and they turn on their TVs and their air conditioners and blah, 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 but the sun has started to go down, then you have a deficit. You get this kind of, you can Google it. I mean, everybody listening to this probably already knows what a duck curve is either, but the challenge here is how do you
Mhm.
kind of, flatten that curve out so that you have, the power that you need when you need it, and you can sort of free yourself from the constraints of the solar cycle. Batteries are part of how we do that. but the goal here for the utility is like, okay, we have all these batteries, but it doesn't necessarily help the utility if they don't have some way of kind of utilizing all those batteries themselves. And so, I mean, the upshot of all of this is that it's going to make it easier for a state like California to continue adding renewables. It takes away one argument in favor of needing to build new fossil fuel infrastructure like gas peaker plants. You may not need to do that if you can make better use of these VPPs, which has cost benefits, but also obviously climate and emissions benefits as well by not doing that. And also, we're talking about data centers and AI and all of this, and we just need to get as many electrons in the grid, as fast as humanly possible for the lowest cost. And building infrastructure, no matter what kind it is just you know we everybody knows it takes a long time, it's expensive, blah blah blah. So if there's things we can do that are easier, we need to be doing them. And I think what this experiment shows in California is that VPPs really are a promising way to do that.
Yeah, and taking the path of least resistance makes a whole lot of sense, and I'm sure
Yeah.
we'll talk too about what this means in the broader scale beyond California, and we're talking about the grid as a whole. We'll get to that, I'm sure, but before we do, I'm curious to hear your perspective on where, a VPP experiment like this one in California fits into the broader strategy of modernizing the grid. Are these VPPs bonus capacity? Are they core to planning? Like how do they fit in with other tools or strategies that might be complementary to ensure that we can flatten that curve and that we can, build the grid that we need for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have to be essential. And I think the challenge up to now has been that there's probably not enough known about how much resource is there, how to use it effectively. I'm sure that there are also kind of policy and regulatory barriers, both at a state and local level, but also, in the sort of federal FERC cross-border electricity market. What are the rules for implementing these things, and how do we organize them on a technical point of view? Which somebody else could probably give you like a better answer on the details of that per se. But I think, but I do understand that there are policy barriers here. And it's something, and including in California. I mean, I was going to mention that. So this is just news from this week that there was a California um, energy package that's been passed by the state legislature that actually zeroed out funding for this very program that we're talking about.
Mhm.
This is a sort of contradiction at the policy level here, where this is um, a tool that's available and should be tapped broadly, but there still are some kind of barriers in getting it implemented.
Why? I guess that's really what it boils down to.
Why?
Why, if why everything, right? Like
Oh
if we
god,
have
why? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
a lot of different elements of this point to this is a good idea to help solve a problem that we are all scratching our heads about. Why cut the funding?
In the case of California, this cutting funding for this specific program, I honestly don't know. Yeah, I'm confused by that as well, because when this test that we're talking about happened, it got a hugely positive response from every person involved, and I couldn't you know, I tried to find anyone to say anything critical about it, and it just seemed like a big success, like all around. So I'm not sure if this just sort of slipped through the cracks somehow on a state legislature funding issue, or if there's some darker forces of lobbying going on behind the scenes that I don't know about. It would be a good story. That's a kind of follow up story to take from here. And I should say that although there are clearly things that can be done, at all levels to streamline this process or get more of these things built. VPPs actually are growing very quickly. There was just, a statistic from Wood Mackenzie this week about, I think it was about between 13 and 14% growth of VPPs in North America from last year to this year. It's something on the order of dozens of gigawatts now worth of VPP capacity. I mean, so we're talking about, a lot of power plants worth of VPP capacity that are now available now on the grid in the US. And that's been growing rapidly. So this is happening. And I think, I don't want to be too dire about the outlook here, because actually I think this is one of the positive stories in the energy transition. And it's a kind of thing that, it's going to continue driving itself, because the financial benefits for all players are very clear. So it's kind of a win-win for everyone involved. So I think it will keep accelerating.
Yeah, and we'll take the W. We don't often get to say this is a great, happy ending kind of a story, so
Yes,
we'll take the
I'll take
progress,
it.
we'll take what we can get.
These days,
And,
I'll take it.
right? You mentioned too something I would love to hear your perspective on. When it comes to the financial incentives, obviously including the customer in that calculus is very, very important. Especially in a state like California. Utility rates in California get brought up in the national conversation about affordability very, very often. I was looking this morning. Since the late 1980s, power prices in California have been at least 10% higher than the country as a whole. Rates have surged in recent years, though, from about a third higher than the national average in 2015 to over 80% higher last year, which is really, really significant. So, when we think about these kinds of experiments that might have an impact on the end customer, whether it's the battery that they have in their home or the bill that they're getting at the end of each month, what's the perspective like for customers? What's the perception and what's the incentive for these people to participate in a program like this?
Well, I mean, definitely if you are someone who has solar and storage on your house, then participating in this is uh, definitely a kind of a clear win. I mean, sort of feels like kind of a no-brainer to me because you're getting when your battery gets tapped in this way. First of all, you can opt out. People ask this question of what if there's a blackout and the utility has already drained my whole battery and then I'm kind of left with nothing. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, you have an option to kind of be involved or not. And my understanding is all of this stuff is kind of being controlled by apps. It's all very digitalized. So, but if this is a program that you participate in, and I would love to, if there are people listening to this who've had a different experience, I would love to hear from them. But if this is a program you're participating in, you're getting money off of your electric bill at the end of the month by sharing access to your battery, depending on how much that's used. And to the extent that smoothing out this duck curve prevents the utilities from having to, build big new transmission lines or generation or, avoid massive capital spending on new infrastructure, that definitely helps everybody's bills stay a little bit lower. So I think there's a lot of benefits, and I think another thing that this does is if you're someone who is thinking about getting solar for your house, and you haven't done it yet because it feels expensive, participating in a VPP kind of program is a way to accelerate the amortization of a new purchase like that and make it actually more affordable for more people. I think that's how it's working out right now. Again, if people have a different experience, I would love to hear from them because this is all kind of new and developing. But I think that's the basic value proposition.
Yeah, and we'll put Tim's, email address in the description of the episode so people
Sweet.
can slide into the DMs if they
Please
have an
do.
idea for a story.
Yes,
But,
please do.
I literally this morning in my inbox saw a headline, and granted it was from a pro electrification nonprofit called Rewiring America, but if all US households built rooftop solar panels and batteries and adopted efficient electric appliances, the country could offset all the growing demand from data centers. So I think this kind of ties back into the idea that it's not all doom and gloom. It is unlikely that that happens in the next year, right? That we need all of this power to happen. But it's a possibility. This is a solution. This is a path forward. I think a lot of it comes down to the ways that utilities are communicating that to customers as well. And this is something we've talked a lot about on the show. That it's hard for utilities to create that connection to establish a little bit of a sense of urgency to redefine the economics of solar on your rooftop, right? Like all of these different kinds of conversations are really paramount to how utilities communicate the path forward to their customers because that really really matters. And they could probably, I'm going to say, like do a better job of it, right? Like we could do a better job of communicating all of this to the average person who just knows their utility because of their bill that they get at
Their
the end of the
bill.
month, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the strongest
Yeah.
message that people. I mean, that's the strongest means of communication that utilities are ever going to have is what's the number that's written on that bill, and people want it to be lower. And if they see it going
Yeah.
higher, they're going to be upset and looking for solutions. When there is something like this that's available, yeah, definitely should be. That's I think that was part of the idea with this test last month was let's just try to get a better sense of what we're actually able to do here so we can help make that case. So yeah, I think we'll probably see more of that.
And as we see more of that, as that case expands, I would love to hear your, prediction or idea of where this might scale next. How does this model scale outside of California? You mentioned that there are some complications when it comes to regulation and permitting and all of those big thorny issues. But where might this also make sense? Is it in, a PJM and ERCOT, the Southeast? Like where could you see something like this working?
I'll be honest and say that I don't have enough information about, the specific cases for each of those grid regions to make a strong argument in favor of one or the other. But I think, my sense is that this could work very well just about everywhere. And, especially any place where you have high penetration of renewables, batteries, EVs, any of these kinds of distributed energy resources, also places, I mean, if you imagine kind of like a cold state in the Northeast where people are using, maybe electric heat during part of the day, is there some level of control of the thermostat that, could be incorporated into a VPP to kind of turn down electricity demand at certain, particularly cold days, or there's some way you could work around that. So I think there's I think there's a lot of opportunity for the whole country with these kinds of things, or probably the world. Sky's the limit.
Yeah, a global solution.
Yeah,
You know, it
that's great.
when we talk about the potential of something like this happening at a national scale, I think we would be remiss not to have a little bit of a conversation about who's in the Oval Office, and the impact of Trump 2.0 on technology like this, on, the scaling of technology like this. Um, Given the Trump DOE's attitudes toward renewables, not good necessarily. What's your expectation for the next 3.5 years for technology like this? Does it feel like the cat's out of the bag, or does it feel like there might be some hiccups?
I think that, VPPs are sort of like one of those things that are, maybe benefit a little from being so wonky and kind of, in the weeds, and they're not an obvious sort of political target. And I think actually, if you're concerned about uh federal government changing incentives for wind and solar, or putting up all of these barriers to wind projects that we've seen the administration do in the last several weeks and months, taking away tax credits, all of that kind of stuff, it's going to become more complicated to build renewable energy projects for the next few years at least. And in that type of context, something like a VPP again is just a really great way to meet growing electricity demand without feeling this pressure to build new high carbon generation assets, which I think is really the important kind of climate takeaway here. Is, their utilities are under pressure to solve this sort of electricity emergency. It's a word that, people in politics have used. I don't know that we're in that stage yet, but, growing electricity demand. And what's the best way to do that? I think they're under pressure in some quarters to, that just means we have to keep all the coal plants running, and we have to build new gas plants, and et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a way to, and because the economics of it are kind of beneficial to customers. They're beneficial to the companies that are installing and running these batteries, like Sunrun and Tesla. It's beneficial for the utility. It doesn't need carbon price or regulatory push to really make sense. Also, all the incentives feel like they're sort of lined up in the right direction. And so I think there's a lot of room for this to kind of continue gaining momentum despite the political circumstance that we're in.
Yeah, I feel like it's a point in the column for the wonks. If something is too confusing to politicize, perfect. We
Yeah,
balance that
just
with,
keep it.
like,
I feel like
communications to
now we're
customers.
we're kind of blowing it on this podcast by talking about all of this stuff, and that we're gonna
I
raise
know.
some red
This is
flags. So
This is the Insiders podcast.
this is the
Don't
insider
share it
part.
with
Okay.
anyone.
They know the people listening to this know about it already probably, so
Yeah, they know, they know.
they know.
You know, the when we think about this idea of, the quote unquote energy emergency and where the funding is going and what's happening with renewables investments in particular, there's a story I want to get your perspective on too that I know you guys wrote about at Semafor. Recently covered news from JP Morgan, US's biggest bank, essentially suggesting that we're moving into this quote new energy security age end quote that will be about more than just fossil fuels. It's not just about the drill baby drill. There's also critical minerals and the grid and nuclear and R&D that will come to kind of redefine what it means to be energy dominant. What's your perspective on something like this in light of the conversation that we've just had about VPPs? I'm curious to just hear what that kind of statement or suggestion from JP Morgan means for the industry and for people listening to this.
Yeah. I mean, the that paper from JP Morgan this week, which we covered, was really interesting because it was sort of a vote. It felt like a very strong vote of confidence in the trajectory of the energy transition, that maybe it was, more strident than the dominant political narrative of the moment, which is that like the energy transition was misguided and should never have happened and is, the cause of all evil, and isn't happening anyway. That's like the line that we hear most often from the administration these days. um and I think that certain quarters would sort of like to believe that that's true, and so that narrative gets sort of repeated. I mean, what you're seeing from JP Morgan though is that, this they're in this report, they're not speaking specifically about, their own bank's financed emissions, or, necessarily revealing very much about how they are allocating funding to fossil fuels versus clean energy. And I think that that ratio has been evening out in recent years. um, but what the report just says is that this is happening. You have to, it's real, you have to prepare for it, and so having this sort of more myopic view on the next 5 or 10 or 15 years of global economic development, where we assume that fossil fuels just continue to totally dominate everything and there's no peak for any of them anywhere in sight, you know, I I also believe is misguided. And this, it's just kind of interesting to see that same message coming from the largest US bank. They still clearly feel that way. And I think that, what I my conversations with them about that report, that, were very clear that this is the advice that they're giving to all of their clients across all sectors, but this is the world that we need to prepare for, which is, you know not that fossil fuels are necessarily disappearing soon, but that electrification becoming hugely, hugely important. Every country has, new incentive and new means at their disposal to improve their own kind of power security domestically, and provide a new kind of energy security for their countries that is not dependent on fossil fuel trade as much as it used to be. Maybe that's a whole kind of like layer of kind of separation and fragmentation in the global economy that we may see as a result of this transition. That's JP Morgan's view. But at the same time, in this report, which kind of brings us back to VPPs, and what's interesting here is that these electric grids, the ability to move power from one region to another, in part to kind of handle the flow of different resources. Sun is shining, wind is blowing more in one place than another. We need to have some, dynamism in the grid, which is going to also extend across borders, and you will see more of sort of grid diplomacy is the term they use in the JP Morgan report, as opposed to pipelines and, oil tankers, which have been the sort of currency of energy geopolitics for the last several decades. We're moving more into this grid direction. I think you're going to see more VPPs that, I mean, can they extend across borders? We can see international VPP programs more. That's an avenue for partnership between governments, between, from companies from one country and or another, to work together on these. And, what we saw in California, this VPP pilot working so well, I think is an indication that this could work at a much larger scale and would be useful at a much larger scale. So I think, as we sort of picture like what does the next stage of energy security look like, VPPs definitely have to be a part of that, and I think they will be.
Yeah, yeah. It's a great way to kinda cap off the conversation too, and it leaves me with one final question about this VPP pilot. What's the next, like, level up, right? If this was the largest scale experiment that worked, right, in the US, where do we go next? Like, what's the next level up? Is it just more batteries? Is it what happens next?
Well, I think that California's, base is gonna continue to grow. I don't think that in this pilot that was that they tapped 100% of available consumer batteries in the state, so I'm sure there's more that they can do. They need to get more people, to opt in to this program, so that they can kind of include more people in it. I know that's also there's a sort of bureaucratic and paperwork barrier to opting people in. That's something I heard from some of the companies, that maybe it could be a little bit more streamlined to get people involved. So that's something for California regulators, to work on. But I think just doing it with more batteries, and I would love to see. It'd be very interesting to see, like I said, a cross border, something between states, like a kind of regional VPPs situation, or something between Pacific Northwest and Canada. I think there's a lot of opportunities to do some bigger networks here, and I think that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm sure if and when that happens, we will bring you back on, Tim, to talk about it.
I'll be there.
I would love to just run through and get your, like, quick, super hot takes on a couple of questions. The first one is, do you have a recommendation for a book or a piece or a long read or really anything that would be on your must-read list for people who are in the utility industry or people who are listening to this episode?
I mean, there's one thing that just comes to mind. David Wallace Wells had a great column in the New York Times, this week, that I recommend everybody read. That I thought just did a really nice job of, kind of summing up the climate diplomacy moment that we're in, and I think unpacks a few of these sort of political problems or tensions that you alluded to earlier, but also points to areas where we're still making progress. And I think just did a nice job of framing this sort of question of, is the energy transition dead or not? He did, and I had a little text message exchange with David about his piece that you can read in my issue of Net Zero newsletter today. So
Yeah. I love the text element of net zero. It's very fun, feels very modern.
thank you.
I interviewed David, in a previous life for a different show, about climate specifically, and came within an inch, I would say, of totally throwing away my career in media and, like, going to work for a nonprofit. He's got away with words. I definitely will be checking that out. Okay, next one. Most interesting story that you have covered in the energy space in recent memory? Other than, of course, the VPPs in California.
Other than VPPs in California, well, as you may know, I live in Kiev in Ukraine. That's where I'm based, and I've been writing about the energy security situation here, for the last 2.5 years or so, and doing a lot of work around, the role that energy plays in this war, which is very multifaceted, from attacks on energy infrastructure to the way that Russia has leveraged its oil and gas exports for geopolitical, extortion, to some of the work that different really cool Ukrainians are doing now to rebuild, green energy and kind of rebuild a different type of ecosystem. The loss of this kind of coal heartland. I mean, they're really going through a kind of just transition moment in the Donbass, with all the coal territory that has come under occupation, and many former coal miners that have enlisted in the military, and so there's a lot of, different dimensions to this whole story. So that's something that I'm very passionate about covering, and definitely that's an ongoing story that we're still in the thick of. So
Yeah, and incredibly interesting. I fear that that might make the answer to my next question see above. But are there any stories that you think people are just not talking about enough that, need a little bit more attention in this industry?
well, yeah, I mean, definitely Ukraine
See
war
above?
is, yeah, see above. Yeah. No, I mean, I think, my good friend Akshat from Bloomberg had a nice Twitter thread the other day where he was kind of, pointing out some underappreciated facts, one of which was that air conditioning globally will probably consume vastly more electricity in the coming decades than data centers and AI, and nobody's talking enough about ACs and how to solve that problem. It's not a problem actually. I mean, ACs are a critical climate adaptation need for people who are living in hot places. Um, and but we everybody, AI is very sexy, so people like to talk about that. But actually, maybe we should be spend more time talking about air conditioners.
Yeah. I would like to make the argument that air conditioning is sexy as somebody who just moved into my first New York City apartment that actually has in-unit AC. So, goodbye radiator, new AC, new me. Yeah, this is definitely something that I will be eager to get some more perspective from experts on the show about in the future. It's not all about AI and data centers, despite what we might be reading and talking about over the lunch table. But Tim, this has been just a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for all of the context and the background and the perspective on this very interesting pilot program, where we go next. It has been a real pleasure to have you on Power Perspective. So thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Kinsey. Thank you so much. Anytime.